So yeah, this is exactly what I mean about Quentin Tarantino being a lying sack of shit. See, after he released Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with that horribly inaccurate Bruce Lee portrayal, Bruce Lee's daughter Shannon called him out on it, and I also called him out on his lies on Bruce Lee too. It's just like how he gives fake credit to filmmakers who he didn't rip off. And he hides and doesn't talk about the filmmakers he really did rip off. When he was talking about Bruce Lee, he was fake quoting all these books that he thought maybe others didn't read, like the Polly book. He calls out the book, then goes on to talk about a bunch of shit that wasn't even in the book. I remember telling you about it back then cause I actually read the book and it was nothing like what he said. The guy's literally lying, and the book's author even called him out on it. It's the usual way Tarantino lies about everything. He tries to tell one half-truth and pawns the other 9 lies as truth. Like he tries to give a little bit of credit to filmmakers who he didn't totally rip off, like Stanley Kubrick, and idiots will support him and say, oh look, he gives credit, and when he's totally hiding all the movies and filmmakers' names who he actually did rip off, he goes on to say bullshit like, oh, all his stuff about Bruce Lee was from research from books, but in the movie he has the fake Bruce Lee character saying he'll kick Ali's ass, but in real life Bruce Lee really respected Ali and said he wouldn't want to fight Ali. This is how Westerners make up lies and half-truths all the time to fool people. Just like how that Sega of America president Tom Kalinske fooled everyone into thinking that the Sega 32X failure was all Sega Japan's fault, but actually it was all Sega USA's fault. You can't just look up a YouTube video because they took it all from that Console Wars book, which was a biased book written to make it look like Kalinske and Sega USA was the victim. He's good at avoiding the blame. If we think logically, it makes sense because the US side wasn't high for a new console, but Kalinske was proud of what he did with the Genesis since it had a strong market share. He wanted to milk that success, hence why US side pushed for Sega 32X while Japan was already working on the Sega Saturn. The US side wanted to make it an add-on to milk the Genesis. You can't go off of the book because the book had a lot of inconsistencies. I read the book a long time ago and not all of it was true. Kalinske was warping too many things and make himself seem like some tragic hero. Sega of America didn't want a new console because the Genesis was so successful. They wanted to milk the success of the Genesis, and it was their idea to push for an add-on instead of building a new console, hence the 32X. 32X was more of a US thing. It was Sega USA's fault. 32X was their making, it was never a Japan thing. And it's funny how they tried to just push away all the blame. Japan always wanted a new console, not an add-on. The US side wanted to make it an add-on. Kalinske was acting with a pretty big ego and he pissed off a lot of people on the Japan side, so communication wasn't great. Fact of the matter is 32X is a US thing just cause they were asked to make something new, which they have to anyways cause next gen was coming up, they had to make something new, so blaming Japan cause they asked them to make something new is dumb. The next gen was coming but they made a shit 32X as an add-on cause they didn't want a new console. That's the US issue. The US pushed for their own thing and the product they pushed for and developed failed. Sega US with Kalinske was getting pretty arrogant during that time because of their success marketing the Genesis. Even if they didn't know about the Saturn development or was blindsided by the Saturn announcement, at the end of the day they still made a shit product. They could have made a better, more powerful console. Sega US was given a lot of resources. And if you look at their track record, Sega US was horrible when given the resources to develop their own products. They were only good at marketing the Genesis console. They were also given a game development budget but developed no games of merit. And even when given the resources, the 32X was the same. They were given a shot to make a console they saw fit and they opted for an add-on and failed. And it wasn't a stopgap for them. To them they thought it was a winning formula to create an add-on to bank off of the Genesis market share. Obviously they made a bad choice. Japan just told them to make something for the next gen, they didn't tell them to make it an add-on. It was Sega USA's idea to make it an add-on and they pushed for it. But even if it wasn't an add-on, there's no guarantee it would have succeeded either. They only had 9 months to develop it. I think that's why they went with the add-on approach. Either way, it was a US idea and it failed. Simple as that. Of course there was some tension between the US and Japan side cause US side was acting arrogant, and what's dumb is US trying to blame it all on Japan when it wasn't true at all. US developed the 32X and US wanted an add-on instead of a console. You see all these YouTube videos saying all this warped history, they're just getting it all from the book from Kalinske's Warped Stories. 32X was a US product and add-on idea was US. They were so proud of their Genesis market share, so it all makes sense why they would push for an add-on. And it being a stopgap was the US fault for making it an add-on instead of a new console. They didn't want to lose their Genesis market share. Americans could word it any way they want, but fact is they were tasked to make something for next gen and they failed. Maybe to them they feel 32-bit isn't impressive enough of an upgrade, which they're wrong about since it depends how you make the console. They wrongly understood the power of a next-gen 32-bit console. So the US side didn't see it as a leap, hence they figure why not make it an add-on, which is a problem of them not understanding how big of a leap a properly made 32-bit standalone console can be. Even if the 32X succeeded, which it didn't, the Saturn was coming out and the 32X would have soon become irrelevant regardless. Also shows a lack of foresight from the US side by not seeing the importance of a proper 32-bit console and making it into an add-on. The PlayStation alone would have trounced the 32X. The problem is the US side didn't see the actual big leap of a proper 32-bit console and thought a shitty add-on was enough, which it wasn't. And either way PlayStation would have kicked their asses cause of the third-party support. 32X of course adds some power over the Genesis, but it still wouldn't have competed with a proper 32-bit console cause you're still bottlenecked. Funny how the American side just diverts blame for everything. They were asked to make something for the next 32-bit generation, which of course they have to. PlayStation and other next-gen systems were coming, but the US side felt it wasn't a big enough leap, which is their mistake, so they pushed for an add-on as a result, which was also their own fault. It's like someone suggested I play a basketball game and I lost, and I blamed it all on the person who asked me to play. Why would the Japanese side release the Saturn so suddenly without telling the US side though, and why would they ask the US side to develop a console in the first place if they were already working on the Saturn? What we know is that the Japanese side did ask the US side to develop something, but why? If the Saturn was already in the works. Well, regardless of looking at the US side or Japanese side, it was the US side who wanted it to be an add-on and made one. Doesn't matter what side you look on, that's what happened. There might have been some animosity, but the issue is the narrative now is that it's 100% Japan's fault, which is so far from the truth. It's the US side that decided to make the 32X an add-on, and their lack of foresight to think 32-bit wasn't that much of a leap. They still managed to word it in a way to divert blame from the American side, which is so funny when US chose to make an add-on instead cause they didn't see 32-bit as a leap, then they made bad decisions. Japan's side was probably pissed off already from the arrogant Americans, so they said do it your way. Japan knew the Americans didn't know anything about development and were a bunch of marketers. So then why would Japanese side ask Americans to develop a console when they already knew Americans didn't know how to develop a console and already had the Saturn in the works? We don't know all the details. But what we do know is Japan and US were talking about making something to compete for next gen, which of course you have to, and ask to why US was making something themselves I'm not sure, but the facts are the US side didn't understand 32-bit was a big leap and they chose to make an add-on to piggyback off of the Genesis success. Hence they made a bad choice and developed a bad product. That's on the US side. I'm sure Sega Japan and Sega US had a rift because Sega US side was acting all arrogant after having marketed the Genesis so well. And they were acting like they were the head of Sega, which pissed off the Japanese side since Japan made all the products. All Kalinsk did was package it with Sonic and that's it. But Japan can't be blamed for 32X cause they had no hand in deciding it to make it an add-on or how it was made. The Japanese side probably got fed up with Kalinsk and Sega USA's arrogance and said do it your way and gave US side freedom to make their own thing. Either way, US developed the Sega 32X and it was their decision to make it an add-on and they failed badly, simple as that. And it's not like they were completely blindsided by the Saturn. That's impossible cause we all knew the Saturn and PlayStation were coming at least a year or more before release. And if they don't know about the Saturn release date, then that's their issue cause I knew about the Saturn and PlayStation a year before they came out, so Sega USA should have known as well. Even if I only had 9 months to develop it, and I doubt they only had 9 months, I wouldn't have made the 32X, that's for sure. 32X was a dumb decision and even as a kid I knew that. When I heard about the 32X as an add-on as a kid I knew it made no sense. Why make some weaker add-on when a full-fledged PlayStation is coming? An add-on is a dumb decision. If they had made it a full-fledged console that could at least compete on power, they had a chance at competing. Also the US side was hoping they could make a better product than the Japan side to show up Japan too cause there was a power struggle going on. The US side was given autonomy. And they were thinking cool, let's make something. And of course they're hoping to make something that can beat or impress the Japanese side on, but they made a dumb decision underestimating the potential of 32-bit. And making an add-on instead. I knew about the Saturn and PlayStation a year before release, so I was deciding which to get next. I'm pretty sure the US was hoping the 32X would be a big success to show up Japan. Maybe a reason why they didn't market or push the Saturn very hard, because they saw it as a competitor to the 32X. But an add-on isn't a good idea regardless. Well, supposedly they only had 9 months to develop it, would be hard to make it a full console, and that's why they went with the add-on as I mentioned. Well, either way I knew for sure the 32X was dumb back then cause of the limited cartridge size. You had to go CD. The 32X was just a bottleneck system, and for someone who didn't have a Genesis you had to go buy it too, and then a 32X, which means you won't be growing your market share at all. Thing is, I heard that it was Sega America who wanted to release the 32X faster, hence the shorter development time cause they wanted to release it faster ahead of others and ahead of the Saturn. Cause I remember it affected Saturn too. There were some games like Doom that 32X got and Saturn didn't. Some exclusive 32X deals. And for sure it was Kalinsk's decision to forego a new console and make an add-on instead to bank off of his Genesis success. They actually had time, and they were originally even planning a console that was a hybrid of the 32X and Genesis called the Neptune. US side seemed certain 32X was the way to go. They felt the add-on was a winning idea. Sega of America made a lot of bad decisions as they got more power, but Kalinsk of course takes no blame for anything. He made a lot of false statements. I remember I told you before in interviews on TV, Kalinsk made a lot of incorrect statements, you can look it up. There was a long period of time when US side knew about Saturn and they decided to ignore Saturn to focus on the 32X cause they wanted 32X to win. They really thought the 32X was the winning strategy and they wanted 32X to win cause they were in a power struggle with the Japanese. They purposely didn't market Saturn in the beginning and focused all on 32X because of the power struggle. Kalinsk thought that he can bank on his Genesis market share and that he can sell anything. And now he avoids all the blame. He can't be blame-free when they made the 32X and marketed it so hard. But from Kalinsk's side it's 100% never his fault, he just takes credit whenever he can and avoids blame. That's exactly what his book read like. Kalinsk's book was basically to try to start some drama so that he could get a movie deal. It was completely biased. Sega Japan CFO even came out and said that Sega USA was very independent and they were running things really poorly, and of course with Japanese people they are very modest when talking. They will never directly come outright and say Kalinsk is messing things up. In that Sega Japan CFO interview he said he should have controlled the Sega USA better and they lacked consolidated accounting so they didn't know about how bad the finances were on the US side. Listen. Doesn't mean Sega US side didn't fuck up. They could have done well with their independence but they didn't. I think you don't understand Japan's culture enough. The way they talk, Japanese people are very modest and understated. They avoid direct conflict, so when they talk they will never point the finger at anyone. Instead they always try to sound very modest and say how maybe they could have done better, whereas the Western side is all point fingers. And Kalinsk got himself on the board of directors and marketed the Genesis well, so the Japanese can't kick him out very easily. The Japanese CFO is how Japanese people talk. They are very modest and don't directly blame others. For Japanese standards, the CFO was already being super serious. They came out and said Sega USA had a lot of power and it was Sega USA who fucked up. And because accounting standards back then weren't up to par yet, they didn't realize that until later. And the way Japanese talk, they always have to speak modestly and somehow put themselves as partly at fault. It's how every Japanese person talks. But what that CFO said is that Sega USA had independence and they fucked up their finances and Japan didn't know until later. This happens when you go international and one side is so good at marketing themselves. Either way, Kalinsk says it's not his fault is pretty bullshit. It's like what I said before, Sega USA had funds and resources to even develop their own games and they never made anything of merit. These are facts. They were making failure after failure. I've seen interviews where Kalinsk, just like Tarantino, was trying to steal credit. In Kalinsk's case he tried to steal Sonic's design elements and claim credit for it, but the Japanese designers later came out to show their much earlier design sketches of Sonic already having those features. But I am still wondering, why would Sega Japan ask Sega USA to develop a console when they had no console development experience and already had a plan to develop the Saturn? I don't know what their communication is, but 32X was a dumb idea. Sega USA of course knew about Saturn. I even knew about it a year before it released, and they wanted their 32X to be successful instead, and knowing that a 32-bit Saturn is being planned. My point is the whole bullshit going on is where Kalinsk literally takes no blame and steals and takes all the credit. Now that is black and white, and he even tried to steal Sonic's design and take credit for it. What you see on Wikipedia of course will say Kalinsk was the hero and Japan was to blame, but of course we all know Wikipedia is just written by other people, who probably read Kalinsk's biased book. Japanese of course always have this ideology of continuous improvement called Kaizen. Like I told you before about Toyota continuously improving parts that aren't even in production anymore. I was searching the other day for a baseball glove. I was deciding between the Wilson A1000 2024 model and the Rawlings A9 and the Mizuno MVP Prime glove. I was worried about the R9 webbing durability for catching fly balls and pitches. Mizuno would be a bit more reliable with the webbing, but for more money. I already got a Wilson in full grain leather, but the big three brands all have similar tiers of gloves. But lately the Western brands, as expected, have all inflated their prices for their pro level tiers. Meanwhile Mizuno still hasn't yet for their pro level. And in this pro tier, the Wilson A1000 is the best, then the Mizuno MVP Prime second and Rawlings third, and normally I would go for the Wilson because of the full grain leather, but I can get this Mizuno MVP Prime with steer hide leather for the same price, so that's a no-brainer. The Mizuno gloves leather feels more fuzzy. For baseball gloves they don't use Horween anymore, not even for top tier gloves. At this level it's all US steer hide. And the next level Mizuno and Rawlings use kip leather. And the interesting thing is, even when they call it US steer hide, the better US steer hide leather is actually all tanned in Japan and the lesser ones are tanned outside of Japan. The best baseball glove craftsmen in the world, just like anything else, are all from Japan, and it's not even close. Also Wilson's head baseball glove designer is the legendary Aso Shigeki, who is Japanese. And besides US steer hide leather that's actually tanned in Japan, the other best leather used for baseball gloves is leather that's made from Japanese cows, where they give the cows a very particular diet and growing environment to get a particular type of hide. Just like with everything else, Japanese people are OCD and always put so much attention to detail and have so much dedication to their craft. These guys I watched online recently all say Japanese leather and Japanese baseball gloves are made with the highest standards and are the best in the world. Just like with Mezpool cues, and Yonex tennis rackets, and Toyota cars, all made to impossibly high standards. I even have a friend who sells parts for instruments and pianos, and he said that the Japanese piano makers like Yamaha and Kawai have the strictest standards and are the most demanding clientele. He said that the Japanese would keep sending back parts to him because it wasn't good enough to meet their standards, and that frustrated him. It's like when Toyota and BMW collaborated on an engine one time, and when BMW sent Toyota their parts, the Toyota people basically saw the parts and had to re-engineer and remachine them all to their own standards, and that engine turned out to be BMW's most reliable engine. After BMW went back to their own engine, those engines became unreliable again. It's the same with electronics. I've had my Panasonic Plasma TV over 13 years with no issues. It just won't die. I've never owned any Japanese electronics that have died on me. My Panasonic Discman still works perfectly too and sounds great. On the other hand, I've had all these Korean electronics die on me. One of my LG receivers started having issues a few months after I got it. One of my friend owns a Samsung TV which started displaying lines across the display a year after she got it. Now my LG phone's USB port is dying too and doesn't work when I plug in the cable. Koreans are like Westerners, they are all about marketing, promoting all these features on their TVs and phones and in the end making a subpar product. My next TV will probably be a Sony. I refuse to get any more Korean electronics. Just like how Korean movies and dramas are all shallow and stolen from Japanese or Hong Kong movies or dramas, their pop music is all derived from Japanese idol culture and Western electronic music. Hell, they even have their own Pocky knockoff snack called Pepero. Is there anything Koreans won't steal from? But yeah, I really like Wilson gloves too because of its design and structure. A lot of good designs from Wilson gloves since they used Aso Shijiki as their head designer for decades. So good details in Wilson's too. For Mizuno, you need to get the Mizuno Pro Haga series to have it be made in Japan and those are quite pricey. With Japanese stuff though, even if it's not made in Japan, the quality is still quite good cause they're so strict with the quality control. You see all the Japanese dollar stuff like in Daiso and the Uniqlo clothes, they're not all made in Japan but the quality is so good because Japanese people are so demanding. Even with Mizuno's lower tier gloves, it's still way better built than the earlier model Wilson A1000. But the 2024 Wilson A1000 got a lot better since they moved the factory away from Philippines. Now the 2024 Wilson A1000 is made in the same factory by the same techs as their A2000 and A2K and the quality is so much higher now. So I bought and compared the 2022 vs 2024 Wilson A1000 and it's not even close in quality. Now the 2024 Wilson A1000 has a similar build to the Mizuno MVP Prime. However, the Wilson as a result upped the price and costs a bit more, so the Mizuno is still the better bang for the buck. I'm having a hard time breaking in my Mizuno glove though cause the leather is so rigid and so durable. It feels like a fossilized rock. Goes to show Mizuno just gives you the real deal leather and lets you deal with the rest. Also when I look at Japanese gloves, the logo is way more substantial. Like an American glove you just see a plain cheap patch or just a casual stitch of the company name, but with Japanese gloves the brand logo is this huge substantial patch, or super thick embroidery weave of the logo that's 3D and sticks out. They look like plagues. Even Wilson's Japanese gloves which are made in Japan for the Japanese market are way higher quality than the US ones. And they had to change the logo patch for the Japanese staff, a much more substantial and nicer looking logo. In North America, Wilson gloves just have the light Wilson stitching on it. In Japan the Wilson staff Japanese gloves is a very thick Wilson knit yarn logo that's 3D with a backdrop too. I need a substantial glove for myself because I play catch for 3 hours daily and catch takes a much bigger toll on the glove than a baseball game does. Especially if I'm playing seriously, then the glove needs to be top quality kip leather, else it won't last more than 2 years with the amount of wear I'm putting it through playing catch all the time. I'm also looking at baseball bats, but it's a tough decision. Metal bats are better and hit farther, but some baseball leagues require wooden bats and getting better with a wooden bat would mean I can also be that much better with a metal bat too. Someday I might join a baseball league, so then a wooden bat would be nice too. So I guess you are into baseball quite a bit these days? I play from time to time, but that's not the only sport I watch. For boxing, Naya Inoue is the greatest boxer I've ever seen. Well, I never saw Muhammad Ali box live, so I can't say for sure, but Naya Inoue is definitely better than any boxer in the modern era. Mike Tyson had a period of dominance that was pretty much unequaled, but his prime didn't last very long. Inoue has unified all the belts in his weight class and he keeps moving up in weight classes. Casuals will tell you that Manny Pacquiao was better, but he never unified all the belts like Inoue did, and Manny lacks the combination of accuracy, speed, and power Inoue has. Unlike Manny, Inoue has no trilogies because he never lost. And unlike Floyd Mayweather, he doesn't dodge his matches. He doesn't pick his fights. He just goes for the champion in his class and knocks them out. He's been destroying every champion he's gone up against so far. He's the greatest pound-for-pound boxer ever. Moving on to tennis, I can tell you that Pete Sampras and Roger Federer were the best I've ever seen. Both of them were very complete and very dominant. Of course Sampras and Federer never got to play each other during their prime, sadly. I do think that tennis of the 1980s and 1990s was more fun and interesting to watch though, because all the players played so different from each other, so there was more specialists. Like the baseline winning return play of Agassi versus the serve and volley play of Sampras. Back then a match like Andre Agassi vs Goran Ivanisevic was a must-watch. Or Lendl will play Chang or Stefan Edberg vs Sampras. Then you had John McEnroe and older guys too, all using very different rackets back then, so their hit was very different. Nowadays the big three all play very similar, so while they won a lot of titles it's not because of their unique play style. Or for baseball it's Shohei Ohtani. He's the greatest baseball player ever and he's barely into his prime. Because he's been doing stuff we haven't seen since Babe Ruth. And unlike Babe Ruth, Ohtani plays against much better competition. I mean, Babe Ruth played 100 years ago and in a segregated league. He wasn't necessarily playing all the best baseball players, since some of the best at that time like Josh Gibson played in the Nego leagues. Ohtani is doing this unprecedented stuff as a two-way hitter and pitcher in the modern day MLB. Or in pool and snooker. Snooker is a much harder sport than pool. Even Efren Reyes, arguably the best pool player ever, would get his ass handed to him in snooker. In snooker you have to have proper form, else you aren't winning any games, let alone being the world champion. That's why Stephen Hendry or Ronnie O'Sullivan, the best snooker players ever, could probably beat the pool world champion without much effort on a bad day. And for hockey too. So many casuals keep saying Wayne Gretzky is the greatest ever. No, they are all wrong and proves none of them really paid attention to hockey. Wayne Gretzky was good, but he had a stacked team and was protected by the league and his teammates. He wasn't the main reason why the Oilers won all those titles because that entire team was stacked top to bottom with Hall of Famers. The greatest ever is Mario Lemieux. His career was plagued with injuries, but despite that he still led a poor quality Penguins roster to 2 titles. He didn't have the help Gretzky had, and that combination of size and skill is unprecedented. He's second all-time in goals per game and in playoff goals per game, and in both categories he's ahead of Gretzky. He didn't have as many titles and total records because he didn't get to play with a stacked roster like Gretzky and didn't have that longevity either. But casuals only look at awards anyways. I care about their actual skill. But basketball is the sport I'm most passionate about. I used to be a huge Bulls fan in the 1990s, and I mean a true fan. I watched all their games. I don't just look up some Michael Jordan stats and claim I was a fan. I remember all their plays and what happened in each game. Oh, so what's your opinion on the greatest player of all time? That's a debate NBA fans all talk about. Seems like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and sometimes Kobe Bryant are in those discussions. It's tough between Jordan and LeBron. I love both these players and watched all their games. I would say if it came down to it, Jordan was a better peak scorer and peak defender, and his mentality is slightly tougher. But LeBron can carry teams in a way I don't think Jordan could have. I don't think Jordan could have taken that 2007 Cavs team to the finals like LeBron did, for example. As for Kobe, he's one of the most overrated players ever, and it's usually the uneducated casuals who talk about him. They keep saying that Kobe is close to Jordan because of their playstyles, but if you study closely, he isn't close to Jordan at all. Now I'm not just talking about the difference in stats and awards. Of course Jordan has 4 more MVPs, 4 more finals MVPs, 8 more scoring titles, defensive player of the year, averages 5 more points per game, shoots 5% better, etc. I'm talking about their actual playstyles. Kobe didn't respect the triangle offense sometimes, while Jordan learned to trust Phil Jackson and ended up being quite good in the offense. That's why Phil Jackson quit the team after that 2004 finals, because Kobe kept playing hero ball instead of playing in the triangle, and Phil got fed up and left the team and ended up calling Kobe uncoachable in his book. So from a team player mentality, Kobe isn't close to Jordan. He often just slows the offense down by playing way too much ISO and 1v1. You see him pump faking about 100 times and then trying to do a cool looking fadeaway. Sometimes even if the defender isn't close to him, he'll do it, and he won't elevate himself enough from the ground for his fadeaway like Jordan. People keep talking about Kobe making tough shots, but oftentimes he hurt his team more than he helped it with those bad shots. Kobe's basketball IQ just isn't high enough, and that's the case for most high school players that came into the NBA during that time. LeBron really was an exception. He was NBA ready the moment he entered the league, but that was rare. If you look in the 80s and 90s, most of the players who entered into the league played a good 2 to 4 years of basketball in college where they learned the fundamentals. But then in the 2000s, after Kevin Garnett got drafted, you had all these unpolished high schoolers entering the NBA, and thus a lot of bad basketball IQ and selfish play in the 2000s. Iverson, T-Mac, Kobe, these guys didn't have good basketball IQ and played too selfishly. Iverson I do kind of give a pass sometimes because of his height, but T-Mac is just a pussy and also one of the most overrated players ever. T-Mac would always disappear in the most important games. Blew a 3-1 lead before in his prime, disappeared in the elimination games. A bit of a stat pad or two. That's why he never got out of the first round. That's why when the Houston Rockets got him, the Rockets actually ended up being better when T-Mac was injured. I was telling everyone that losing Steve Francis and Cuttino Mobley for T-Mac wasn't a good trade-off because they are losing their depth, a bit of their defensive versatility, whereas T-Mac was basically a liability on defense in that point in his career. During that 2009 run, the Rockets got past the first round finally, and that was when T-Mac was out injured. Just like I told everyone, the Rockets were better pairing Yao Ming with Francis and Mobley than with T-Mac. Another guy who was really overrated was Jason Williams. Couldn't shoot the ball at all and totally slowed the offense down. Everyone talks about his flashy passes, but he was terrible for the Kings. As soon as they got rid of him for Mike Bibby, they start doing a lot better. Wilt Chamberlain is another guy who I think is pretty overrated. Everyone talks about his stats cause he put up all these huge scoring numbers, but he never really helped his team win because he didn't have good basketball IQ. Everyone says that Bill Russell always beat him because Russell had the better team. Isn't entirely true. Sure, when Wilt was with the Warriors he didn't have many great teammates, but even with him averaging 50 points a game they still got nowhere deep in the playoffs. He would always take these bad fadeaway jump shots much like Kevin Garnett would, and these are lower percentage shots. The main difference between Shaq and Wilt I think is that Shaq, especially when coached by Phil Jackson, really improved his basketball IQ, and Shaq would never take any bad shots the way Wilt did sometimes. People criticize Shaq for not having many moves. But if his moves are that hard to stop, why would he use other moves? What Wilt should have done is just dunk the basketball or use a hook shot like Shaq did, but instead he would sometimes take these ill-advised mid-range jumpers and fadeaways. Then when Alex Hannum comes and starts coaching him and teaching him the right way to play the game, then he finally makes it to the finals with the Warriors and 76ers. By the way, that's when he did have a better team than Bill Russell. He had 3 other Hall of Famers on the 76ers with him, Chet Walker, Hal Greer and Billy Cunningham, while Russell only had John Havlicek and Sam Jones left at that time. So by the time Wilt played on the 76ers, he already had a better team than Russell at that time, and yet would still blow a 3-1 lead to the Celtics in 1968. And then when he had Jerry West and Elgin Baylor on the Lakers, He definitely should have beaten the Celtics in 1969 but choked yet again. Bill Sharman had to force him to focus on the defense and rebounding in order for him to win again with the Lakers. The main difference between Russell and Wilt is Russell knew how to play the right way, had better basketball IQ and had the clutch mentality in the playoffs. Case in point, when Wilt blocks a shot it always goes out of bounds. Dwight Howard does this too. A shot blocker with good basketball IQ like Russell and Hakeem though, would block it to a teammate to start a fast break and keep it inbounds for another possession. That's the difference between Wilt and Russell. Kareem and Bill Walton, by the way, both these guys were basically upgraded versions of Russell. They had the basketball IQ, the playmaking, and mentality of Russell, but unlike Russell had better offensive skill sets. It's too bad Bill Walton had an injury-plagued career, else he would be right up there after Kareem and Hakeem as an all-time center for me. Arvydas Sabonis too. If he had entered the league in his prime he would have been a top 5 center all-time. Phenomenal basketball IQ and playmaking for a big man. Drazen Petrovic is another guy who was a big what if, he was a dog. Fantastic player with his career cut short. Chris Bosh is also pretty overrated too. Didn't do anything on the Raptors. Couldn't get past the first round. Just put up a bunch of meaningless numbers, that's it. And because he averaged those numbers people thought he was a superstar. But Bosh didn't do anything in Miami. Ended up getting abused by everyone. In the playoffs I saw him disappear against old Kevin Garnett and the Celtics. Then in the finals, old Tim Duncan was basically abusing him. Bosh was soft like butter, couldn't handle anyone. One of the most useless superstars I ever seen. Now Kevin Garnett, although I question his use of the fadeaway jumper sometimes, was a pretty solid defender and rebounder, but Tim Duncan was still much better. Duncan had fundamentals and his basketball IQ was through the roof. Just like Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom, both players are pretty underrated because of all those Kobe fans out there who want people to think Kobe did everything by himself. In reality, Pau Gasol was such a fundamentally solid player and his rebounding and defense was so crucial during those championship years. Kobe basically was struggling to get past the first round of the playoffs until Gasol showed up. Kobe blew a 3-1 lead in the first round to the Suns, a team that was much smaller than the Lakers and had no defense basically. That year Kobe averaged 35 points a game, and then in the playoffs, like always, his averages dropped considerably. I don't care about his 81-point game or his 62-point in 3 quarters and all that crap, that's all regular season. He never did that in the playoffs. Come playoff time, you see his record in elimination games is only 22 points per game and he averages 41% shooting in the finals, right? So yeah, in that Suns series the Suns didn't have their second best player Amuri Stoudemire and Kobe was outplayed by several guys that game including his own teammates. He was outscored by Sean Marion in Game 3, Lamar Odom in Game 4, and Leandro Barbosa in Game 7. And Kobe fans keep saying he was the best player in the world, sure. After Gasol showed up Kobe went all the way to the finals. That 2009 Rockets series and 2010 finals for sure Gasol was the more important and valuable piece. Kobe almost shot them out of the 2010 finals too if Gasol and Odom weren't there. Odom was so polished too. He had a post game, he had the rebounding skills and he passed like a guard but had the height of a forward. People said he was never an all-star, I don't care, Odom was as talented as any forward to play the game. Of course with Kobe around, Odom just ends up turning into a spot-up rebounder for his garbage baskets like everyone else. And don't get me started on how weak the league was back then. All the Kobe fans talking shit about the Western Conference being so good and the defense being tough is all spewing bullshit. After 2005 the hand-checking rules changed so you can't touch perimeter players anymore. So in 2006 the refs didn't know how to call fouls on perimeter players. That's why in 2006 all the top scorers including Kobe, LeBron, Gilbert Arenas, Paul Pierce, Iverson, Melo, Dirk were all basically perimeter players. And the 2006 finals was just a free throw contest by Dwayne Wade. Then in the late 2000s there weren't any really good teams. Kobe fans talk about him beating all those 50-win teams, none of them were over 56 wins. All of them just good but not great teams. All of them were lower seeds than the Lakers anyways. Kobe had a 65-win and a 57-win team, so it's not like he was ever the underdogs. Kobe's never won as an underdog. And all that talk about CP3 winning multiple rings with Kobe if David Stern didn't veto that trade is bullshit too. Kobe's never won with any perimeter star before. Don't give me the Gary Payton and Steve Nash was old crap when they were all-stars the year before. Kobe can't coexist with a perimeter star, it can't happen, that's why Eddie Jones got traded. He's always needed Phil Jackson and an all-star level big man to win. Those are the facts. In that CP3 trade, Gasol and Odom are traded, then how is he getting past those bigger teams? How's he getting past the Spurs and OKC and the LeBron Heatles? So yeah, Kobe's super overrated. He's only averaged over 30 points per game in 1 finals out of 7. Sure, he got hot sometimes, but every role player gets hot. Every playoffs there's at least one guy playing better than Kobe. I've seen Devin Booker and Jamal Murray all have finals runs more impressive than Kobe. Way more efficient and better at passing too. And he's overrated not just offensively but defensively too. Everyone talks about his 12 all-defensive selections. Phil Jackson in his book even called out Kobe for having undeserved all-defensive selections. I've never seen him lock up anyone in the playoffs. Everyone's got his points on him. Gilbert Arenas, Jeremy Lin, Stephen Marbury, Allen Houston all got their career highs on him in fact. I've seen him outplayed by old Penny Hardaway, older Nuggets Allen Iverson, Even role players like Bonzi Wells and Aaron Brooks and Ty Lawson and Glenn Robinson and Jason Terry all outplayed him in the playoffs before. Seriously, people have this double standard about LeBron they won't have for Kobe. They will criticize LeBron nonstop for the 2011 finals, but then for Kobe, who's had at least 3 subpar finals in 2000, 2004 and 2008, they don't say a thing. They will just ignore all of Kobe's bad moments. 2000 finals, he had an 8-point game in Game 5, they ignore it. 2002 vs Spurs, he was outscored by Duncan in 4 out of 5 games, nobody says anything. 2004, he got completely locked up by Tayshaun Prince and had a rape trial, they don't say anything. They even had a standing ovation for him after he came back from the trial. He's the most protected superstar ever, media won't ever criticize him, especially not after his tragic death. 2005, he missed the playoffs in his prime. 2006, he blew a 3-1 lead in the first round. Quit on his team in the Game 7 and was outplayed by Leandro Barbosa. 2007, he was begging for a trade until the Lakers got him Gasol, everyone forgets about that. 2008, he got locked up by James Posey in the playoffs. 2009, he needed Gasol to save his ass in the Rockets series. 2010, he needed Gasol and Arteas to save his ass in the finals. 2011, he got outscored by Jason Terry and JJ Barea in the Game 4 and got swept. 2012, he was outplayed by Ty Lawson. 2013, everyone talks up him hitting those free throws with a torn Achilles, so what, there wasn't much movement required. 2014 to 2016, he was arguably the worst player in the league. In 2016, he had that 60-point game, well, he took 50 shots that game, the most in NBA history, and won 17 games total. Just a massive ball hog. In my all-time list, Kobe is barely in my top 20. I don't think Kobe is better than Giannis or Jokic or Moses Malone or Kevin Durant. I don't care, there's a bunch of NBA players who think Kobe's the GOAT because these players all grew up idolizing Kobe. They don't base his GOAT status on anything subjective. Just like his fans always rely on the buzzwords like Mamba mentality and marketing BS. My top 5 NBA players of all time are Jordan, LeBron, Hakeem, Kareem, and I would say Magic, Duncan and Shaq are all pretty close for that number 5 spot. Hakeem is very underrated and never gets the respect he deserves. He's so fundamentally solid on both ends of the court. So yeah, that's my top 5 all time. I think suggesting that Kobe is barely top 20 all time would be quite a hot take amongst most NBA fans. That's because most NBA fans don't really watch the full-length games. They just watch highlights, or even worse, they see all the LeBron haters and Kobe worshippers online who constantly lie and twist information, and they get their misinformation based off of that and say they know about basketball, then call you a hater and insult you when you tell them facts about what actually happened. For example, everyone thinks Kobe was the main reason why they won gold in 2008. But that 2008 roster besides LeBron and Melo was completely different than the 2004 roster that won bronze. And they blame LeBron for that bronze even though he averaged 11 minutes per game and barely played. And LeBron played more minutes and averaged more points, rebounds and assists than Kobe in the 2008 Olympics, yet Kobe is the one that gets all the credit. And everyone always remembers Kobe's 2 quarters vs Spain in the finals even though he normally sucked in other games. Vs Argentina for instance, he shot 5 out of 14 but nobody remembers it. And what did other people say to you when you told them about these facts? I don't care what others think. Other people don't know what they are talking about. Even online reviewers I don't trust because they often don't test things thoroughly and don't know what they are talking about. Like IGN for example, reviewing Aliens Fire Team and Dynasty Warriors and only giving them a 7 out of 10 because they were too repetitive. Well, of course it's going to be repetitive if you only play it on easy settings. And they gave Yakuza Like a Dragon a 7 out of 10 because they said it had a high difficulty spike, but that's what I liked about it. In my eyes, if you don't beat a game on the hardest difficulty, then you cannot say you really experienced it. Or when all those idiots on HeadFi praised the Otis LCD2 as the perfect reference headphone when I told them the bass wasn't balanced, and nobody believed me. Then when they came out with the Otis LCD3, everyone said it fixed the bass balance issues, which is exactly what I was telling them earlier. Or those dumb 8-bit the controller reviewers on YouTube who all praise the controller saying it's the perfect controller. Well, when I tested it with Street Fighter 2, the pad is defective and any controller with a defective pad can't be the best controller. Hori, they complain, which is too cheap feeling, actually is made of high quality plastic and unlike 8-bit the has a very usable solid pad. Which by the way, is very important for playing retro games. If I don't have a good controller with it pad, I don't use it at all. I find everyone just focuses on the analog sticks nowadays on controllers and saying it's Hall effect with no joystick drift. Well, funny thing is pads don't have that issue. And any retro game including PlayStation 1 games are meant to be played with it pad. 2D games of course work the best, but even early 3D PlayStation games were all designed for pad because that's the controller PlayStation was bundled with at first. And pad works fine for me even for 3D games like Dynasty Warriors. And if it works for Dynasty Warriors, it can work for any game because Dynasty Warriors requires split-second timing and input much like a fighting game. It's just all these casuals online commenting about shit they know nothing about. They watch a highlight of a player and think they know everything. They play a game on the easy difficulty and think they know everything. They often rely on others' opinions to form their own opinions about something instead of forming their own. They'll watch a review online of something by somebody who might not know what they are talking about and they just think it's the truth and facts without actually experiencing it themselves. But I also think that's because you are more sensitive than most other people and you experienced a lot, hence making you more picky and opinionated. That's true. That's also why I can notice things most other people cannot, and I don't trust most people online since I have more knowledge than they do most of the time. I can tell the difference right away if you give me a low-resolution MP3 versus a high-resolution FLAC audio file. I refuse to listen to Bluetooth headphones unless they have apt's lossless codec implemented. When I went to my friend's house, I can tell right away the difference. He had his receiver set to using the lossy Dolby Digital codec and not the lossless Dolby True HD codec. I told him to change it to lossless right away cause I ain't putting up with that low-resolution shit. I'm just super sensitive to everything. Remember when I came to your house and I knew your TV's colors were off because you were using game mode and not cinema mode? And I can easily tell the difference between the lower-end S-Saber DAC chips, which all have this sharp harsh quality to them, to the warmer, more analog-sounding AKM DAC chips. Or the more natural-sounding Cirrus Logic chips. And yeah, I prefer a balanced, detailed, neutral tuning. That's why I love my Sennheiser HD800, one of the greatest headphones ever, especially for detail and soundstage. Just the pads start flaking off after a few years because of the shoddy German engineering, but the headphone is really nice, and so are my FLCA Chinese IEMs from 2011. Still, nothing I've listened to so far can beat them. I really hate how people online keep using Harman curve as reference when it isn't meant to be reference at all. Like those dumb audio science review guys like Amir who use measurements to judge everything. And yeah, most people online who think they know sports never actually played the sport. I played hockey. I know that Mario Lemieux is the greatest of all time, not Wayne Gretzky. I used to do martial arts and boxing too, so I know that Naya Inu is the greatest pound-for-pound boxer, not Manny Pacquiao. I also watched a lot of baseball and play catch 3 hours a day with my glove. That's why I need high-quality Mizuno or Japan-made Wilson gloves, because normal gloves won't last for 2 years due to how intensely I play it. That's how I know Shohei Ohtani is the greatest ever and not Babe Ruth. I also started out playing pool with a snooker cue, which has a much smaller tip and thus lower deflection than a normal pool cue. That's why my pool shots have more spin and also more accuracy, and when I was in my prime I was making shots people said wasn't possible, shots that only Efren Reyes and Stephen Hendry and Ronnie O'Sullivan could make. I of course also played a lot of basketball in my prime before my knees got shot. I even played against Olympic level players. That's why I know Kobe and Wilt are overrated as fuck, and guys like Hakeem Olajuwon and Lamar Odom are very underrated. I also played tennis before and I'm very intense, which is why I know that the Yonex rackets have the best manufacturing standards and tightest tolerances, just like most Japanese technology, and I watched a lot of tennis, which is how I know how dominant guys like Pete Sampras and Jim Courier were back in the day. I also used to play Street Fighter 2 every day in my prime, and I beat the world number 2 Afro Legends and was on PAR with the world number 1 Daigo in my prime. And I would have beaten Daigo too if I wasn't using a shitty Xbox controller pad. Daigo was probably using some high-end fight stick. And I still fought him to a standstill. But I watched some of Daigo's live streams recently and he only beat Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Japanese version CPU on level 4 difficulty, which isn't that difficult. Everyone knows the American version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is more difficult, and I beat the CPU on the highest difficulty, level 8, which only a few people in the world can do. I also beat Dynasty Warriors 2 on the hardest difficulty without any power UPS, which I don't think anyone else in the world did. When I went on message boards and talked about it, everyone said it was impossible and didn't believe me, and after I detailed the strategy on how I did it, some people said it might have been possible. I also hated Doom 64. That was the worst version of Doom because of how narrow the level design was. Super Mario was fun as a kid, but over time as I got older I didn't pay attention to platformers anymore. Those were for kids. Beat 'em up games were the evolution of platformers anyways, due to the extra plane of being able to move up and down the plane, not just left and right. They still make platformers now because kids still need something to play. Western video games I find usually don't have a lot of focus on gameplay or quality control and too much focus on story, which is why games like Grand Theft Auto and Last of Us and Uncharted have such mediocre combat, and they are too story-driven. Story-driven games and modern games in general are too easy and hold the player's hand too much. There's no challenge at all, and if I wanted a good story I would just watch a movie instead. Super Smash Bros. Is overrated because it's too easy to do the special moves. It's basically for casuals. Mortal Kombat 2. The blood and gore are a gimmick. No depth at all. Not to mention games from companies like Bethesda are always a buggy mess when released, and games from Activision or EA just come with a shitload of DLC and microtransactions because they ship you an empty shell of a game. Japanese companies, except for maybe Square Enix, usually give you a good amount of gameplay and a good amount of content. They have better integrity than that. They don't nickel and dime you like Western companies do. But yet when I was a kid I wanted to challenge myself. I could finish Super Mario in a matter of seconds or 1 minute cause there was a secret path to get to the last stage, and I don't have to stop or slow down at all when going through the stage, even with the flames and fire spinning bars, and just blaze through the stage with no stopping. It's not just about finishing with 1 life anymore cause that's a given. It's about how fast and efficient I can finish it, so I'm often running through non-stop. With Contra, it comes down to the angle and timing of your jump and with which weapon is a bit more effective against which boss, so see, I'd shave down some seconds cause back in the day we didn't have many games as a kid, so it's normal to play like that. You'd get so damn good at the game until there's no more room to improve down to the second, then I'd go to the pawn shop and trade it in and buy another used game or trade with a friend, and I'd just deal with the pawn shop owners there. Of course eventually more skill-based games like Street Fighter 2 and Capcom Dungeons and Dragons came out, and I would play those all the time cause the skill ceiling is just so high with those games. Unlike with modern games, you can just keep on improving forever. Most people don't have any eye for details like me either. Most people can't tell the difference between a resistor ladder DAC like my Kayan RU7 and a Delta Sigma DAC like the Shanling UA5 like me. Most people can't tell the difference in detail between a Maisie 109 Pro and a Focal Clear like me. But I can easily tell you most of these headphones are overpriced when you can get a cheaper Shure or HiFiMan which are much more resolving and just call it a day. Most of these expensive headphones are just marketing. That's what Koreans and Westerners do the best is market the shit out of their products. Like Estelle and Kern, that DAP brand Koreans make, they made up that name to be super European sounding, hype up the features, make it look like a rectangle and slap a super high price on it hoping fools will buy it. Koreans learned Western marketing well. K-pop is just a bunch of glorified dancers, they aren't real musicians, they don't play instruments or write their own stuff. But overall I don't think of myself as opinionated or biased or snobby, what I'm saying is just facts. It's the truth. Because I experienced all these things firsthand. Most people did not, and even if they did, they didn't properly experience it or analyze it like I did. Most people didn't know that 2022 Elvis documentary there were some scenes that were wrong chronologically, like they have a scene where he's still in the army meeting his wife Priscilla which was obviously late 1950s, but then they were playing his song Can't Help Falling in Love with You on the radio which was highly inaccurate because that song didn't exist at that time. He recorded that song for the film Blue Hawaii in 1961 after he was discharged from the army. It's actually quite obvious and you don't have to be an Elvis fan to know that because his later songs were more poppy and sensual compared to his earlier edgy rock and roll stuff. So yeah, that scene was off. Most people can't tell the difference between a fight stick with an octagonal gate and a circle gate and a square gate or a Seimetsu and a Senwa stick like me. Most people can't tell the difference between remasterings of records and films. I prefer the recent remasterings from the last 10 years because there was this thing called the loudness wars that music companies engaged in the 90s and 2000s which made most modern releases too loud. They've lost a lot of their dynamics because of the aggressive compression used, and only with recent remasters they've started fixing that and restoring the dynamic range using the original master tapes or records. So any Beatles or Pink Floyd or Jimi Hendrix remaster from the last 10 years is good. But it should be either FLAC, CD, DSD, or Blu-ray audio. No MP3 or streaming of course. Most people probably don't care about how many threads their bed sheets has. They just think the higher the thread count the better. Well, these days you see companies advertising 1000 threads per inch or something. Those are probably not very high quality threads, and in addition to that it's going to be less breathable. I think for me, although Egyptian cotton is nice, it's not breathable enough for me since I sweat easily, and linen is durable but too expensive for me, so I'll stick with bamboo Lysol or rayon. Bed sheets with around 400 threads is perfect because it's fairly breathable for the summer and still fairly warm and durable at the same time. And for my duvet I'll go with regular weight goose down with at least 650 fill power. I tested 5 different brands of bed sheets to compare with repeated use and washing, and the one with the most breathability and durability without any pilling was this brand called Hush, so I might stick with that one. But Silk and Snow also has some good bedding products I've heard as well. I did try many Egyptian cotton bed sheets and it does get softer over time, but I find that even the ones with the lower thread count still run a bit too hot for me since I'm a hot sleeper. So yeah, bamboo rayon or Lysol seems to be the best so far with their moisture wicking and breathability, and that Hush brand seems pretty durable too. And for pillows I prefer the Tempur-Pedic memory foam pillow since theirs is actually memory foam. Other brands that claim they have memory foam pillows aren't actually using memory foam but just regular foam. If you notice, after you sleep with other brands the pillow doesn't retain the shape of your head as well as Tempur-Pedic. It's the same with sunglasses. Maui Jim has color enhancement technology with their sunglasses and they are the ones who started it. Then Ray-Ban decided to have color enhancing shades too with their Chromance technology, so both Maui Jim and Ray-Ban are legit sunglasses brands that have been making them since the beginning. I'm not a fan of the designer fashion brands who make all sorts of shit and just slap their names on everything and charge a high markup. This Korean brand called Gentle Monster for example just copies Ray-Ban's designs, gets some celebrities to wear them, gets Luxottica to manufacture them and charges a high markup, but they don't have the technology that Maui Jim and Ray-Ban do. No color enhancing or a long history of wearable design, just a typical knockoff brand. That's what Koreans do. Chinese copy and knock off a lot of brands too, but they generally don't have the audacity to charge a huge premium for their stuff like Koreans do, so I respect Chinese a bit more than Koreans. And yeah, I noticed my recent Dawn of the Dead 4K Blu-ray remaster, the colors are definitely very off. Because George Romero never changed the color of the movie from the original print, and I watched many home editions many times, so every time it gets remastered I notice the differences. The latest UHD Blu-ray release, the colors and brightness changed drastically. The film in previous home video editions I've seen all have a warm tone to it which makes the blood look vibrant, almost fake red. Now the entire color tone is more cold and muted and more of a blue tint, whereas before it was more of a yellow tint. I'm not sure which print they based it off of though, because I was too young to see the original film in theaters. I do have the original VHS release which I watched when I was 6 years old. But apparently the original director of photography did supervise this transfer, so who knows. The thing is, a lot of people say Laserdisc is more accurate than DVD, but this stems from the early transfer process of DVD since they tried to use digital noise reduction to remove film grain holes. It gave early DVDs an artificial look to the image compared to Laserdisc at the time. Even though Laserdisc is technically inferior to DVD, same thing with early CDs, they didn't do a good job with sampling from the original master tapes or didn't use the original master tapes or records, so early CDs sound inferior to vinyl of course, but CD is a technically superior technology with more dynamic range than vinyl, and these days a modern remastered CD sounds superior to a remastering on vinyl. But there are bands I find overrated like Coldplay, which is similar to modern pop music, just garbage for my ears. K-pop, I already told you they aren't musicians, just glorified dancers. AC/DC is basically just one type of Led Zeppelin song, Queen is super popular because of the documentary, but they aren't that innovative or unique, and Nirvana is just one type of angsty sound with depressing lyrics. These bands are all overrated. But then there's underrated artists like Elliott Smith, who I think more people should know, who have beautiful songwriter and raw vocals. And guys like Donovan from the 1960s and Aguaterbia, this Chilean psychedelic rock band from the 1970s, it's like Jethro Tull but from Chile. More people should know about these bands. Or any of John Frusciante's solo work. Most people only know his work with Red Hot Chili Peppers, but his solo work is amazing as well. And of course most people wouldn't have read as many books or watched as many movies or played as many retro games as me. I played almost every arcade game back then, since I practically lived there, and when I didn't I was using my Super Nintendo with a disc doctor to play all these obscure Japanese games which were never released in the West. And I read pretty much all the major books, from the really old stuff like Beowulf and Tale of Genji, which I consider to be kind of overrated by the way, to the classic Fyodor Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens, and Ursula L. Le Guin. I consider J.K. Rowling to be pretty overrated cause her books aren't very intellectual and are geared towards kids. Same with Stephen King, very shallow horror novels and pretty overrated. And Ernest Hemingway might be the most overrated at all, nothing special about his works, definitely not comparable to Robert Louis Stevenson or Leo Tolstoy, that's for sure. And Jin Yong above them all, since he basically took the world building of J.R.R. Tolkien and combined it with the character building of Charles Dickens. I find the same thing with watches. All the Swiss and German stuff are pretty overpriced. Rolex especially because it's famous, but even brands like Patek Philippe are very overpriced for what they offer when you can get a Grand Seiko for less than the cost of an Omega Speedmaster, another overrated watch, and Grand Seiko has way better polishing and finishing of the dials than any of these super expensive Swiss brands. And the quality of toys, like I said, declined a lot too. Back in the 80s we had good toys like He-Man and Transformers. The quality of blockbusters was high like Back to the Future and E.T., and coming-of-age movies like Stand By Me had a lot of heart, and even modern pop music by Michael Jackson and George Michael were very well produced and made. And with movies it's because I watched so much of it. Like people when they say Tarantino is a great director. These people didn't experience many movies, so they think Tarantino is great. If they watched a lot of international and indie films like me, they would know what Tarantino did is just rip off of other films and other better artus directors like Shaw Brothers and Wong Kar-wai, stick a catchy song in his films and take all the credit for it. So yeah, Tarantino is a douchebag and highly overrated. There's countless better directors that are just kind of unknown because they are independent and indie, directors like Naomi Koz and Yuji Yamada, who are two great Japanese artus directors, right up there with Hirokazu Kurita, who I guess is more well known now because of Shoplifters, although I've been a fan of him since 2005. These guys are right up there with some of the other great international directors like Ken Loach, Mia Hansen-Løve, Wim Wenders, Richard Linklater, Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Akira Kurosawa, Yasujiro Ozu, Wong Kar-wai and Ingmar Bergman. I don't watch any of the Marvel or mainstream Hollywood garbage, it's a waste of my time. If you show me an Adam Sandler movie I will make you pay me to watch it because you are wasting my time. Everything Everywhere All at Once is just okay. Most of the Korean films like Parasite is overrated, it's just some typical thriller with an expected twist. The only Korean films I liked were Secret Sunshine and Burning because they had a little bit of depth, that's it. Fight Club and Blade Runner are overrated, they have a gimmick going on but the characters are pretty shallow. Citizen Kane was overrated too, it was cool for the time but it didn't age very well. Unlike Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca or other movies from that time, the story wasn't as unique or captivating. Most 90s horror films sucked. Blair Witch Project was overrated as fuck, just an amateur college project that somehow got famous. Halloween and all those other slasher films like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street suck, they are just cheap thrills, give me something with substance like Fright Night or Dawn of the Dead. Most of the classic American actors like Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant and John Wayne are super overrated, they only played themselves, they had no acting range and only played one type of character. Only with method actors like Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift we started getting some decent acting. But outside of the USA, guys like Max von Sydow were really good actors but they weren't as famous. Or Takashi Shimura, who collaborated with Akira Kurosawa on 21 films, he was a great actor. But in the USA, those guys are known as iconic actors, but they are iconic because they were in famous movies because they were actors with a lot of acting range. And obviously guys like Harrison Ford and Arnold Schwarzenegger basically only had one type of role too. Keanu Reeves might be the worst actor I've ever seen, every time he's in a film I keep wondering how he keeps getting cast, but it's probably because he's a general all-around nice guy similar to Jimmy Stewart back in the day, so that's why he keeps getting these roles. And don't get me started about Hollywood action movies. They are so overrated it's insane. Like I watched all of the 1980s Hong Kong action flicks, especially the ones directed by John Woo like The Killer and God of Gamblers and A Better Tomorrow, with real actors like Chow Yun-fat and Leslie Chung and Tony Leung and Andy Lau who all perform their own stunts. Of course, these movies have way more action in it and way more depth in it than Hollywood action movies. Die Hard, for example, is super overrated, hardly any action in it, it's barely an action movie. Rambo is just Sylvester Stallone holding a gun, but there's no intricate gunplay like in those Hong Kong films. Terminator 2 is even worse because it's just Arnold holding a gun and barely using it. Saving Private Ryan is also pretty overrated, I found 80s war films like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket better. Apocalypse Now is also super overrated, it's nothing special and barely qualifies as a war film. Hollywood action films didn't get good until they brought in the Hong Kong choreographers like Yuen Woo-ping and Hong Kong directors like John Woo and Chow Yun-fat and Jackie Chan all came over in the 1990s. Then it started getting good, as you can see in films like The Matrix, But this was way later than those Hong Kong films. And in early 2000s you had Crouching Tiger Hidden Dragon, which was a super overrated film that's nothing special, but it got Hollywood more interested in doing those kind of aerobatic stunts and stunt choreography, which is why action scenes nowadays like what you see in Marvel films are all way better than what Hollywood had in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's all from the Hong Kong influence. And that's just the Hong Kong action films. Hong Kong in the 1980s and 1990s was king of cinema. They inspired a lot of Korean gangster and thriller films too. A Better Tomorrow and In the Mood for Love were both very popular in Korea. But then you had so many other genres too, like Sammo Hung's comedy action and comedy horror films. Sinners and Winners, My Lucky Stars, which were both done with Jackie Chan and Yoon Bio, who are Sammo's buddies by the way, Painted Faces, the Mr. Vampire series, all very good films with lots of depth and good humor, and shows you how multifaceted Hong Kong cinema was like back then. Then there's films like A Moment of Romance, Days of Being Wild, Hard Boiled, etc. In addition to the action flicks I listed before, shows you how far ahead Hong Kong was compared to Hollywood back then. So yeah, don't even talk to me about Die Hard and Terminator 2. I watched Burning and Secret Sunshine. I think they were good films, but I still preferred some other Korean films like Handmaiden, Sea Fog, Old Boy, Mother, Joint Security Area, Sunny, etc. Listen. That's because you didn't watch those films enough and you didn't understand it on a deep enough level like me. If you watch it enough you might understand it more. Those films you listed are okay, but all the twists are expected and they follow a typical thriller or drama formula that Korean films all have. Like with Parasite, the twist is very obvious and the film is quite obvious about shoving the message about economic inequality and societal structural differences to your face. I prefer it if the message was more subtle, like in Burning or Secret Sunshine. But then again, those films aren't exactly super great either. I'm just talking about the few Korean films I kind of liked. Train of Busan held promise, but it falls apart halfway throughout the movie, much like a Hideo Kojima Metal Gear Solid game. It's like with everything everywhere all at once. Sure, you keep watching it enough then there's a deeper message and meaning, but overall it's still not going to match up to any of the classics. The 1950s Japanese dramas like Tokyo Story, An Autumn Afternoon, Late Spring, Akira, High and Low, Bugitsu, by the great Japanese masters Kenji Mizoguchi, Yasujiro Ozu, and Akira Kurosawa. Or even newer Japanese directors like Hirokazu Korita. Korita's films, some of my favorites are After the Storm, I Wish, Nobody Knows, Still Walking are probably his best, Shoplifters is his most famous and a good starting point though. But these films have way more depth than any Korean film I watched. Don't even get me started on Train to Busan 2, that's the worst film I've ever watched, barely qualifies as a film actually. The issue with Korean films is, like I said, they are a bit shallow and the plot twists and messages are too predictable. It's like with that film District 9, which I also found to be overrated. It's a movie that just wanted to use the South African apartheid metaphor to get their message across at the sacrifice of an intelligent, believable story. Like in District 9, the aliens who landed there eventually become uneducated third-class citizens living in the slums. That's really stupid because these aliens have the tech to fly there, right? So they are clearly more advanced than us, not just in their knowledge but in their biological evolutionary mentality, so they are already born smarter than us. How the hell would they suddenly be like the slum-living uneducated third-class citizens? It makes no sense at all. The difference in technological and intellectual development between us and any aliens advanced enough to come here is like us vs some animal like a cat or rat. You think we'd sail a huge ship to an island, get stuck there, then for some reason be a third-class citizen to some cats? So stupid. The reason why the movie is so praised is two reasons. It's mainly the nerdy crowd who likes games and stuff more than actually watching great films or reading good intelligent literature. They see a blatantly obvious analogy or metaphor to the apartheid government and they think, oh wow, this must be deep, like the same people who get fooled by Parasite. I find a lot of these crowds generally have terrible tastes and thought. They're often the same crowd who likes the Star Wars sequel trilogies and Tarantino films, which means their cinematic taste is invalid. And probably the same crowd who like Korean dramas too, which are all ripped off of better shows. Like Itaewon Class, which ripped off of the 1989 Hong Kong series Looking Back in Anger. Or Squid Games, which is just a rip-off of the Japanese film Battle Royale, and even Hunger Games. And at the beginning of Reply 1988, this other Korean drama I watched, they talked about how influential A Better Tomorrow 2 was to them, and I couldn't keep watching after that. So yeah, Korean dramas are pretty overrated. But I also find most the popular anime to be overrated as well. The best anime was from the 70s and 80s, back when Japan was more experimental. Stuff like Lupin the Third and Maison Ikkoku were great. The early Ghibli films like Only Yesterday and Night on the Galactic Railroad were all cool too, but not as well known. And for modern anime, I like anything by Satoshi Kon, especially Millennium Actress and Tokyo Godfathers, Makoto Shinkai's Voices from a Distant Star and 5 centimeters a Second, Letter to Momo, and of course the Slam Dunk movie and anime are all really good. Is there anything you aren't picky about? It seems that you can go into detail about anything you see or hear or touch. Books, movies, video games, sports, food. Forgot to mention that you prefer Japanese snacks too, right? Hokkaido potato chips and Japanese gummies. Is there anything Japanese you don't like? That's right. Hokkaido potato chips have more natural flavor, especially if they are from Kalbi or Koikya. Japanese candies taste like fruit and Japanese fruit taste like candy. And obviously their seafood and meat like Matsusaka, Kobe, and Omi beef all from specially raised cattle from certain parts of Japan. There's even olive wagyu where they feed the cattle a special diet mix of olives and grain and the meat ends up not just super marbled and tender but with a unique olive taste as well. For beer I think while Japanese beer is okay, the best beer is the craft beer from where we are in Vancouver, my favorite being the Pullmana aged 2 years which they only have limited stock of. It's a very nice deep sour ale. But while Japanese lack in beer, they make up for with their amazing selection of sake and whiskey. Especially their Yamazaki 25-year-old aged single malt whiskey or some of the aged Sakuro from Hiroshima Prefecture or Hibiki 21-year-old from Suntory. Is there anything better? Perhaps only the best aged Scotch whiskey can come close to competing. And all the craftsmanship they do as well. Uniqlo shirts, ukiyo-e wood block prints, knives and swords, bonsai trees, teapots, their jacquard weave denim jeans from old jacquard looms from Okayama Prefecture, high-quality leather jackets from specially raised cattle, the reliability of their cars and electronics, etc. I mean virtually anything from Japan is guaranteed to be of high quality beyond that of any other country. And of course their porno industry as well. The only thing is sometimes these porno actresses have too much experience and it sounds too fake. I specifically have to dig out the actresses which are amateurs, new to the industry, or who I know came from a J-pop background because sometimes these girls have a career in the music idol industry, don't make it and turn to making AVS. And then if I find them in a porno, it's that much more exciting. Because if they are young and inexperienced then it's more realistic and authentic and more of a turn on. Sometimes in a video game like Yakuza or in a baseball match I might even recognize their faces from an adult video I've seen before. I see. Very detail-oriented.